The crystal chandeliers of the Montague estate threw fractured light across 300 guests in designer gowns and $1,000 suits, but Elijah Montague couldn't shake the cold knot forming beneath his ribs. Something was wrong. He'd learned to trust that instinct 20 years ago, in the back alleys of Brooklyn, when trusting his gut had kept him alive through 3 assassination attempts and a federal sting that sent 5 of his rivals to federal prison. Tonight, in his own home, surrounded by the elite of New York's underworld and legitimate business empires alike, that instinct was screaming. The celebration marked 5 years since he'd consolidated the 5 families under one banner, his banner. 5 years of peace that had made him billions in legitimate real estate, 5 years of careful image cultivation that had transformed the Montague name from whispered fear to whispered respect. And 5 years since he'd last felt this particular chill, the one that meant someone in this room was planning to put a knife between his shoulder blades. He watched the crowd from the mezzanine, his posture relaxed, a glass of Macallan 25 in his hand, his smile fixed in place. Below, his fiancée, Victoria Ashford, glittered in diamonds that cost more than most people's homes, working the room with the effortless charm of someone born to old money. The Ashfords had been legitimate for generations, shipping, textiles, a veneer of respectability that Elijah had needed when he decided to go clean. Their engagement had been announced 6 months ago, and every financial publication in the city had called it the ultimate merger of old and new power. But Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes tonight. Elijah had noticed it 3 hours ago when she'd greeted him at the top of the grand staircase. A flicker of something, nervousness, guilt, that she'd masked too quickly. He'd filed it away, as he filed everything, waiting for the pattern to emerge. Down in the servants' corridor, Elena Vasquez hurried past the kitchen with a tray of champagne flutes balanced on one palm, her other hand clutching her daughter's small fingers. Isabella was supposed to be in the staff quarters with the other children, but the girl had been restless all evening, her dark eyes darting at shadows, her small body trembling with a fear Elena couldn't explain. "Mommy, the bad men are here," Isabella had whispered 2 hours ago when Elena had tried to put her to bed. "The ones who smell like smoke and lies." Elena had dismissed it as childish imagination, the same overactive fantasy that had Isabella talking to thin air in the garden and hiding under tables when strangers visited. But now, watching her daughter's face as they passed through the eastern corridor, Elena felt her own unease growing. The child had always been perceptive. Too perceptive for a 4-year-old, the other staff said. She noticed things adults overlooked. The way Mr. Montague's head of security kept checking his watch every 17 minutes during meetings, the faint scent of cigar smoke on a man who claimed not to smoke, the tiny scratches on the silverware that no one else had spotted. "You need to stay in the nursery, mi amor," Elena said gently, pulling Isabella aside as a cluster of guests passed by, their laughter too loud, too forced. "I'll bring you some of the chocolate cake from the kitchen, the one with the gold leaf. You remember how much you loved it last time." Isabella shook her head, her grip on Elena's hand tightening until it hurt. "They're going to hurt the man with the sad eyes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The one who stands alone and watches everyone. He's going to bleed, and the bad men will take everything from him, and then they'll come for us." Elena froze. The man who stands alone and watches everyone. That could only be Mr. Montague himself. She'd seen him on the mezzanine not 15 minutes ago, isolated despite the crowd, his expression unreadable but his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there when she'd served him coffee that morning. "Isa, sweetheart, you can't say things like that. You can't. The man with the red tie keeps touching his jacket," Isabella continued, her voice taking on the strange, distant quality that always preceded her most unsettling observations. "He has something in the inside pocket, something that clicks." And the woman with the yellow hair, she looked at the big clock on the wall 3 times when she thought no one was watching. "And the man who smells like smoke, he keeps looking at the chandelier chains, like he's counting them, over and over." Elena's blood went cold. The man with the red tie was Marcus Webb, Mr. Montague's head of security, a position he'd held for 7 years, a man she'd trusted with her own life on more than one occasion. The woman with the yellow hair was Victoria Ashford, the future Mrs. Montague. And the man who smelled like smoke. She'd noticed him earlier, a heavy-set figure in a dark suit who'd lingered near the eastern staircase, his face half hidden by the shadows, a faint aroma of Cuban cigars clinging to his coat, even though no one had been smoking in the main hall. She crouched down to Isabella's level, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Listen to me carefully, Isa. I need you to go back to the nursery and stay there. Don't come out for anyone. Not the other staff, not the guards, not anyone. Do you understand? But Mommy, the bad men, they won't hurt you if you stay hidden," Elena lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I need you to be brave for me, okay? Be my brave little girl." "Can you do that?" Isabella nodded slowly, her eyes still filled with that strange, distant light. "You'll come back, Mommy. You promise, I promise." Elena kissed her daughter's forehead, then steered her back toward the staff quarters with a gentle push. "Go now. Quickly. And don't make a sound." She watched until Isabella disappeared through the service door, then turned back toward the main hall, her mind racing. She should go to Mr. Montague, warn him about what her daughter had seen. But what would she say? A 4-year-old's ramblings about bad men and bleeding? He'd dismiss her as hysterical, maybe even fire her for disturbing the celebration. The staff had learned long ago to keep their heads down and their observations to themselves. The Montague household ran on discretion, and Elena had been here long enough to know that speaking out of turn was the quickest path to the street. But her daughter had never been wrong before. The time she'd told Elena about the leak in the West Wing boiler room, 3 days before a pipe burst and flooded the library. The time she'd pointed out the gas leak in the kitchen that the chef had dismissed as imagined smells. The time she'd whispered about the sad man in the garden, who turned out to be one of Mr. Montague's business associates, hiding in the hedges to avoid a hit squad that had arrived 20 minutes later. Elena made a decision. She would find Mr. Montague's personal assistant, the one person in this household who might listen without ridicule. David Chen had been with Mr. Montague for 12 years, since before the consolidation, and he'd always treated the staff with a respect that the others withheld. He'd believe her. Or at least, he'd know the right questions to ask. She cut through the service corridor, weaving past kitchen staff and catering servers, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that matched her racing pulse. The main hall was visible through a narrow window at the end of the corridor, the chandeliers blazing, the guests swirling in their elaborate dance of power and deception. And there, on the mezzanine, Elijah Montague still stood alone, his glass half empty, his eyes scanning the crowd with the predatory patience of a wolf watching a sheepfold. She was 20 feet from the door to the main hall when she heard the first sound of chaos from above. A crash, like glass shattering, followed by a woman's scream. Then the unmistakable crack of a gunshot, muffled but clear, somewhere in the eastern wing where Isabella had just gone. Elena's world narrowed to a single point of terror. She forgot about warnings and conspiracies and the careful rules of staff discretion. She forgot about everything except her daughter's face, the way her small fingers had clung to Elena's hand, the terrified certainty in her voice when she'd said, "They're going to hurt the man with the sad eyes." She turned and ran, leaving the chaos behind her, her only thought a prayer that she wasn't already too late. In the mezzanine, Elijah Montague heard the gunshot the same moment he saw Victoria Ashford's mask slip. Her perfect composure cracked, just for an instant, but he saw it. The flash of something that wasn't shock, wasn't fear, wasn't any emotion that belonged to an innocent woman watching her celebration turn to violence. She knew. The thought crystallized in his mind with terrible clarity, and in that instant, a dozen small details fell into place. The way she'd been distant for weeks. The late-night phone calls she'd taken in the library, her voice too low to hear. The new friends she'd been making, men with no legitimate business ties, men whose names he'd found on his security reports and dismissed as social climbing. Marcus Webb was beside him in seconds, his hand on the gun hidden beneath his jacket. "Sir, we need to move. Eastern Wing, I've got a team." "No." Elijah's voice was ice. "You stay right here, Marcus. In fact, put both hands where I can see them." Webb's face went pale. "Sir, your jacket pocket. The one with the clicking sound." Elijah had heard Isabella's warning 3 hours ago, delivered by the child who'd appeared at his side in the library, her voice soft and certain. He dismissed her then, filed the information away as childish nonsense, but now it all made a terrible kind of sense. Take it out. Slowly. Marcus's hand moved, and Elijah saw the glint of a device, a detonator, small and deadly, its red light blinking in time with his heartbeat. Before Webb could press the button, Elijah's fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing against the railing. The device clattered to the floor, and Elijah crushed it under his heel all around him. Guests were screaming, scattering, the celebration dissolving into chaos. But Elijah had eyes for only one thing, the staircase that led down to the eastern wing, where he'd heard the gunshot, where the loyal maid's daughter had been sent to safety. The maid, Elena, the one who'd come to him 3 hours ago, her face pale, her voice trembling as she'd relayed her daughter's observations. He dismissed her too, told her to take the child back to the nursery, and not to worry. He'd been so focused on his own instincts, his own certainties, that he'd ignored the one person in this household who'd tried to warn him. He moved through the chaos with the efficiency of a man who'd survived worse, his gun in his hand, his mind cold and calculating. The eastern wing was a maze of corridors and service passages, and somewhere in that maze, 2 people who mattered were in danger. He'd find them. He'd protect them. And then he'd destroy every person in this building who'd thought they could take everything from him. The first body he found was David Chen's, crumpled in a service corridor with a bullet through his chest. The man who'd served him for 12 years, who'd known all his secrets, who'd never once betrayed his trust. Elijah knelt beside him, felt for a pulse, found nothing but cooling skin. He'd been dead for minutes. Shot before the celebration even began, perhaps, silenced so he couldn't warn his employer. Elijah's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Another name added to the list. Another debt to collect. A sound from the end of the corridor made him look up. Footsteps, running. A child's cry, quickly stifled. Then Elena's voice, sharp with terror. "I say run. Run, and don't look back." Elijah moved without thinking, his body remembering survival instincts that his cultivated new life had tried to bury. He rounded the corner just in time to see the scene. Elena Vasquez on her knees in the corridor, her arms wrapped around a man's leg, trying to drag him down while Isabella scrambled away, her small feet pounding against the marble. The man was heavy-set, the scent of cigar smoke clinging to his coat, a gun in his hand aimed at the running child. One shot. One perfect shot, and the man's head snapped back, his body crumpling to the ground beside Elena. Elijah didn't wait to see if he was dead. He rushed forward, pulling Elena to her feet, scanning the corridor for more threats. "Where's the girl?" he demanded. "Where did she go?" "Down there," Elena pointed, her hand shaking. "She ran toward the old wine cellar. The one we never use. She knows the tunnels. She's explored them before. Stay here." Elijah pushed her toward a doorway, out of the line of fire. "Don't move, don't make a sound. I'll find her." He ran, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, his mind racing through the layout of his own home. The old wine cellar had been sealed years ago, a relic from a previous owner that he'd never bothered to renovate. But there were tunnels beneath the house, catacombs really, that connected the cellar to the old service entrances on the east side. If Isabella knew about them, if she'd found a way to navigate them, he found her in the tunnel entrance, huddled against the ancient stone, her small body shaking with silent sobs. When she saw him, she scrambled backward, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, little one." He crouched down, keeping his voice soft, his movements slow. "It's Mr. Montague. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." "Don't trust the man with the red tie," Isabella whispered, her voice cracking. "He has a friend who's waiting, a friend with a very big gun. They're going to make you choose between me and Mommy, and if you choose wrong, they'll hurt you anyway." Elijah's blood ran cold. "Where did you hear that? I say, who told you?" "I heard them talking in the kitchen before the party. They thought I couldn't understand, but I do." Her eyes met his, filled with a wisdom that had no place in a 4-year-old's face. "The man with the red tie, he's angry, because you never gave him what he wanted. And the woman with the yellow hair, she made a promise to another man, a man who wants your empire. And the smoke-smelling man, he's just a soldier. He does what he's told. She was describing the conspiracy with a clarity that left Elijah breathless. This child, this impossible, perceptive child, had seen through layers of deception that had taken trained intelligence analysts months to unravel. And now, in the darkness of the tunnel, her small hand reaching out to touch his face, she spoke with the certainty of someone who'd already glimpsed the full shape of the horror to come. "They're in the main hall now," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "All the bad men. They're waiting for the clock to strike midnight, and when it does, they'll take everything. But I know a way out, Mr. Montague. A way that no one else knows. If we can reach the old door in the garden, we can get to the city, and we can find people who can help." Elijah stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. The midnight deadline. The presence in the main hall. The hidden exit that no one knew about. He'd had the estate surveyed 3 times, and no one had ever mentioned a door in the garden. "I've always been able to see things," Isabella said, as if reading his thoughts. "Things that aren't there yet, but will be. My mommy says I have a gift, but she's scared of it. She thinks it means I'm cursed." "You're not cursed," Elijah said, and the words came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had almost forgotten how to believe in hope. "You're not cursed, little one. You're the only thing in this whole building that isn't part of the deception." She smiled then, a fragile, tremulous smile that made his heart ache with a tenderness he'd thought himself incapable of. "Then come with me," she said, her small hand closing around his. "Come with me, and I'll show you the way out." And Elijah Montague, cold and calculating, the man who'd survived conspiracies and assassinations and years of blood-soaked warfare, nodded at a 4-year-old and let her lead him into the darkness. They emerged into the garden behind the eastern hedge, a spot he'd never noticed, a hidden door concealed by ancient ivy that had been growing for decades. Isabella navigated the darkness like she'd been born to it, her small step sure, her grip on his hand unwavering. "Where are we going?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "To the city," she said, as if it were the most natural answer in the world. "There's a man there, an old man who lives in a blue house. He'll help us. He's been waiting for you to come." Elijah's mind raced. He knew no one in the city, no old man in a blue house. But something in the child's voice made him believe, made him trust in a way he hadn't trusted anyone in years. They made their way through the silent streets, past the great houses and the gated communities, past the enclaves of the rich and the desperate. The city was a different place at midnight, a place of shadows and whispered secrets, but Isabella walked through it like she owned it, her head held high, her courage a small, fierce flame in the darkness. And at the end of a narrow street, in a neighborhood he'd never entered, they found the blue house. It was small, unprepossessing, the paint peeling from its walls, but there was a light in the window, and when the door opened, a man stood there with eyes that looked as if they'd seen a century of secrets. "You came," he said softly, and his gaze fell on Isabella with an expression that was almost reverence. "I told you she would, didn't I, the child who sees what others miss?" Elijah stepped forward, his body tense, his mind screaming warnings. But Isabella's hand tightened on his, and he felt a wave of calm wash over him, a certainty that defied all his instincts. "I'm afraid I don't understand," he said carefully. "I don't know who you are or why a child would bring me here. You don't need to understand everything, Elijah Montague." The old man smiled, and his eyes gleamed with a light that wasn't quite human. "You just need to trust her, as I have trusted her, for longer than you know." And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a house he'd never seen, in a part of the city that didn't exist on any map, Elijah Montague felt his certainty shatter. The conspiracy he'd thought was everything, the betrayal he'd believed was total, it was just the beginning. The real threat was still waiting, patient and vast, and the only guide he had was a 4-year-old girl with eyes that saw too much. "Come inside," the old man said, his voice soft as velvet. "We have much to discuss, and not much time. The clock is still ticking, Elijah Montague. And when it stops, There will be no mercy for any of us. Inside the blue house, the world seemed to fold in on itself. The walls were lined with shelves that held not books but artifacts, strange carvings, ancient coins, journals whose pages were filled with symbols Elijah couldn't read. The old man led them to a small room at the back of the house, where a fire crackled in the hearth and tea was waiting, already poured, as if he'd known they were coming. "Sit," the old man said, and his voice was warm but carried an edge of urgency. "We have only hours before the next move, and there is much you need to understand." Elijah lowered himself into a worn armchair, his muscles coiled and ready. Beside him, Isabella climbed onto a small stool near the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames with an expression of deep concentration. The old man sat opposite them, his hands wrapped around his tea, and for a long moment no one spoke. "Who are you?" Elijah asked finally. "How do you know this child?" "How do you know me?" The old man smiled, a thin, sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Samuel, though that hasn't been my true name for a very long time. I was once an advisor to a man much like yourself, a man who built an empire on the backs of the desperate and the dreaming. I watched him fall, and I made a vow that I would never let another man make the same mistakes. This is about my empire." Elijah leaned forward, his voice hard. "You think I've made mistakes? You think I don't know every detail of my own operation, every skeleton in every closet?" "I think you know what you were meant to know," Samuel interrupted, his voice level. "I think you have been fed information for years, carefully curated by people who wanted you to see only what they wished you to see. You're a brilliant man, Elijah Montague, but brilliance is no shield against betrayal when the betrayers are the ones you trust the most." Elijah's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to deny, but Isabella's earlier warnings echoed in his mind. The man with the red tie, the woman with the yellow hair, the conspiracy that had been building for months, hidden in plain sight. "Tell me," he said through gritted teeth. "Tell me everything, or I'll leave this house and find my own answers." "You could try," Samuel said mildly, "but you wouldn't get far. The men who want you dead have already taken your estate. Your security team, the ones who weren't in on the plot, have been neutralized. Your fiancé has issued a statement to the press, declaring you missing, presumed deceased. The police are already searching for the woman who ran away from you, fearing for her life."
Elena.
Elijah's blood went cold. "She's not with you. The maid, the mother of this child. She's safe for now." Samuel's voice softened. "A friend of mine extracted her from the estate before the final phase of the plot could begin. She's in a safe house across the city, waiting for word. But she won't be safe for long, Elijah. The men who plan this, they don't leave witnesses. And your maid saw more than she was meant to. I need to get to her." Elijah started to rise. "Sit down." Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. "You go charging out there now. You'll get yourself killed, and her with you. The time for action is not yet. First, you must understand what you're fighting and why." Isabella stirred on her stool, her eyes still fixed on the flames. "The bad men," she whispered. "They're not just bad, are they? They're part of something bigger. Something that's been growing for a very long time." Samuel nodded, a deep sadness in his eyes. "The child sees clearly, as she always has. This conspiracy against you, Elijah, is only the first domino in a chain that stretches back decades. The men who want her empire destroyed are pawns in a much larger game, a game that involves the very foundations of power in this city." Elijah's mind raced, connecting dots he'd never seen before. The mysterious rivals who'd emerged in the last few years, always one step ahead of his intelligence networks. The legitimate businessmen who'd seemed too eager to partner with him, their proposals too perfect to be true. The whispers of a shadow council, a cabal that controlled the underworld from the shadows, maintaining a balance of power that no one man could disrupt. The old families, he breathed. The ones who've been here since the beginning. The ones who never accepted that a man like me could rise to their level. Now you begin to understand. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes blazing. They've been orchestrating this for years, ever since you consolidated the 5 families and threatened their grip on the city's power. They couldn't destroy you directly. You were too strong, Too careful, too well protected. So they decided to take you apart from the inside, to corrupt the people closest to you, to turn your own success into your undoing.
Victoria.
Elijah spat the name like poison. She was part of it from the beginning. The engagement, the press, the perfect merger of old and new, it was all designed to get me to lower my guard. Your fiancé is indeed one of their agents, Samuel confirmed. The Ashfords have been part of the Shadow Council for generations. They were the ones who selected her, who groomed her from childhood to infiltrate your circle and bring you down. Marcus Webb, your head of security, he was their backup plan, placed in your organization 6 years ago when it became clear that the Ashfords' initial approach had failed. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. He'd trusted Webb with everything, his security protocols, his safe houses, the very layout of his private quarters. The man had been at his side through dozens of tense negotiations and 3 near-death encounters. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet ever could. The others, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Webb and Victoria are just the beginning. Who else is part of this? Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a thick leather notebook, its pages dog-eared and filled with densely packed handwriting. I've been tracking this network for a very long time. Your empire is riddled with their people, Elijah. Some are willing participants, promised power and wealth beyond their reach. Others are coerced, their families threatened, their secrets held hostage. And a very few, are like you, blind to the knives being sharpened against their spines. Isabella slipped off her stool and padded over to Elijah, her small hand finding his again. But there are good people too, she said softly. People who've been waiting for you. People who know what the council is doing and want to help stop them. Samuel nodded, a spark of approval in his ancient eyes. The child is right. You have allies still, Elijah. Loyalists who've kept their heads down and their mouths shut, waiting for the moment when you'd need them. I have their names. I have their locations. And I have a plan. Then start talking, Elijah said, gripping Isabella's hand like a lifeline. Tell me how we destroy them. Every last one of them. Samuel spread the notebook across the worn oak table, its pages revealing a web of names, dates, and locations that stretched across the city like the roots of some ancient, invasive tree. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes tracing the connections, his mind cataloging each piece of information with the precision of a man who'd spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of power. Your inner circle is compromised at every level, Samuel began, tapping a finger on a cluster of names near the center of the web. Marcus Webb was the most obvious, but he was never the most dangerous. That distinction belongs to the ones you'd never suspect, the quiet ones, the ones who seemed too loyal to ever betray you. Elijah's gaze settled on a name near the periphery. Martin Cole, my chief financial officer. He's been with me for 8 years. He helped me launder the consolidation funds through 15 shell companies. He knows every account, every offshore holding. He's also been feeding information to the Ashfords for the past 4 years. Samuel interrupted, his voice flat. His wife has a gambling problem that's cost them 3 properties and their children's college funds. The council took over her debts 2 years ago, and Martin's been their puppet ever since. Every financial move you've made, every hidden account you've opened, they've known about it within hours. Elijah's stomach turned. He'd trusted Cole with the lifeblood of his empire, the intricate financial architecture that had turned blood money into legitimate billions. If the council knew the full extent of his holdings, they could dismantle everything in a matter of days. Why haven't they done it already? He asked, his voice controlled. If they have all this information, why go through the elaborate plan at the celebration? Why not just freeze my accounts and watch me crumble? Because freezing your accounts would expose their hand, Samuel explained. The council's power depends on secrecy, Elijah. They operate from the shadows, pulling strings that no one sees. A direct financial assault would leave evidence, trail back to them, invite investigations they can't afford. This way, he gestured at the web on the page. They dismantle you from the inside, absorb your assets through legal channels, and leave no trace of their involvement. You become a tragic story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of power. And they become richer than they've ever been. Isabella had drifted back to her stool by the fire, but her eyes were fixed on the notebook as if she could see something beyond the written words. "They're scared of something," she said softly. "Something that hasn't happened yet. That's why they're moving so fast, taking such big risks. There's a deadline they're trying to meet." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "The child is perceptive. There's an election coming, Elijah. The mayor's office, the district attorney's seat. The council has candidates in both races, candidates they've bankrolled and groomed for years. But the current administration has been investigating them, slowly, quietly, gathering evidence that could bring them all down. The council needs to consolidate their power before the election cycle ends. That means eliminating you, absorbing your empire, and using your assets to fund their political machine." Elijah understood now. The careful manipulation, the slow erosion of his defenses, the betrayal of the people he'd trusted most. It was all part of a larger game, a game that had been in motion long before he'd ever consolidated the 5 families. He'd been a target from the moment he'd risen to power, a threat to an established order that had existed for centuries. "I want names," he said, his voice cold as winter steel. "Every name in that notebook. Every traitor, every pawn, every council member. And I want their weaknesses." Samuel nodded, turning to a fresh page. "Your fiancée Victoria is the key to the Ashford network. She has a younger sister, Amelia, who was institutionalized after a breakdown 2 years ago. The council has been paying for her care, using her as leverage to keep Victoria in line. If we could locate Amelia, secure her safety, Victoria would turn on her own family," Elijah interrupted. "Victoria would do anything to protect her sister," Samuel said, his eyes glinting. "She was never a willing participant in this conspiracy. The Ashfords groomed her, yes, but they also threaten the one person she loves more than power or prestige. If we can take that leverage away from them, she'll have no reason to stay loyal." Elijah absorbed the information, filing it away with the rest. "And Webb, what's his weakness?" "His weakness is his ego." Samuel's smile was thin, humorless. "Webb always believed he deserved more than you gave him. He saw you rise from nothing, and he resented every success because he felt entitled to it himself. The council promised him your seat at the head of the table, a position he's been coveting for years. But Webb is also a coward at heart. If he believes the council is going to lose, he'll turn on them in an instant, desperate to save his own skin." Elijah had seen that kind of greed before, that emptiness that no amount of power could fill. Webb's betrayal still stung, still cut deeper than he wanted to admit, but understanding the man's motives made it easier to bear. There was no loyalty to betray, no friendship to mourn, just the hollow shell of a man who'd been hollow long before he'd ever entered Elijah's service. And the others, Elijah pressed. "The minor players, the ones who are coerced. The coerced ones are your best chance for a clean victory," Samuel said, tapping a section of the web that was marked in red ink. "I've identified 37 people in your organization who are being blackmailed or threatened. If we can break that coercion, give them a way out that doesn't involve prison or death, they'll turn on the council with a vengeance. They've been waiting for a leader who'd offer them that chance." Isabella slid off her stool again, approaching the table with that strange, distant look in her eyes. "There's a place," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A building with no name, in a part of the city that everyone forgot. That's where they keep the records, the ones that prove everything. If we can get to those records, we can free all the people who've been trapped." Samuel's jaw tightened. The child is right. The council maintains a central archive, a facility that holds copies of every incriminating document they've collected over the years. It's heavily guarded, buried deep beneath one of their legitimate businesses, but if we could access it. "The records are the key," Elijah said, understanding dawning. "If we have the records, we have leverage. We can expose every council member, every conspiracy, every act of corruption. We can turn their own weapons against them." "Exactly." Samuel's eyes held a flicker of something that might have been hope. "But accessing the archive is a suicide mission, Elijah. The facility is designed to be impenetrable, motion sensors, armed guards, biometric locks, redundant security systems. Even with the best team, the odds of getting in and out alive are negligible. Elijah looked at Isabella, at the determination in her small face, the wisdom in her ancient eyes. He thought of Elena, waiting in a safe house across the city, fearing for her daughter's life. He thought of David Chen, bleeding out in a service corridor, his loyalty rewarded with a bullet. He thought of everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed, everything he was about to lose. "Then we don't do it the obvious way," he said, his voice hardening. "We don't break in through the front door. We find another entrance, a way in that they've forgotten exists." "Isabella," he turned to the child, "you said you could see things that aren't there yet. Can you see a way into that facility?" Isabella closed her eyes, her small body swaying slightly. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the crackling fire and the distant hum of the city outside. Then she opened her eyes, and they were filled with a light that made Elijah's breath catch. "There's a tunnel," she said, her voice distant and dreamy. "A tunnel that runs beneath the old waterworks, beneath the foundation of the building. It's flooded now, but there's a way through, a path that the water hasn't touched. It leads to a maintenance hatch, a hatch that hasn't been opened in decades. The men who guard the building don't know about it. They think the tunnel was sealed years ago." Samuel was staring at her with undisguised awe. "I've been studying the council's archive for 10 years, and I never found anything about a maintenance hatch." "They forgot about it," Isabella said simply. "They forgot because they believe that being powerful means being right about everything. They're wrong. That's why they're going to lose." Elijah felt the pieces of the plan clicking into place, a pattern emerging from the chaos. The archive, the records, the break in the coercion chain, it was all connected, all part of a single, elegant strategy that would bring the council to its knees. "Then that's our target," he said, his voice firm. "We find this hatch, we get the records, and we expose every last one of them. And we do it in time to save Elena and everyone else they've threatened." Isabella smiled, her small hand reaching for his again. "We will, Mr. Montague. I've seen it. They don't know what's coming for them." The morning light crept through the grime-caked windows of the blue house, casting pale rectangles across the worn floorboards. Elijah had not slept. He'd spent the night studying Samuel's notebook, memorizing names and connections, tracing the tendrils of the council's influence through every corner of his empire. The more he learned, the colder his blood ran. The council hadn't just infiltrated his organization, they'd gutted it from the inside, leaving only a hollow shell that looked like power but held nothing but rot. Isabella had fallen asleep by the fire, her small body curled on a pile of cushions, her face peaceful in a way that seemed impossible given everything she'd witnessed. Elena's daughter, the child who'd saved his life, and then calmly outlined a plan to destroy a century-old conspiracy. She was remarkable, and Elijah found himself watching her sleep with a tenderness that surprised him. He'd never had children, never wanted them. His life had been too dangerous, too uncertain. But watching Isabella, he felt a flicker of something he'd thought was long dead. Regret. Longing. A quiet wish for a different kind of life. Samuel emerged from the back room as the sun climbed higher, a stack of photographs in his hands. "I've been thinking about the archive," he said, spreading the images across the table. "The child's tunnel is our best option, but we need a diversion, something that pulls the guards away from their posts long enough for us to get in and out." Elijah studied the photographs. They showed the archive building from every angle, a nondescript office tower in the industrial district, its ground floor occupied by a legitimate shipping company, its basement levels hidden from view. The entrance to the tunnel would be 2 blocks away, beneath the abandoned waterworks that Isabella had described. "We need to hit them where they're vulnerable," Elijah said, his tactical mind already working. "The council's operations rely on communication, secure lines, encrypted channels, a network of informants who report everything. If we can disrupt that network, create chaos in their intelligence gathering, they'll have to divert resources to investigate." Samuel nodded slowly. "I know people who can do that. Hackers, information brokers, people who've been waiting for a chance to strike at the council's digital infrastructure. But it will take time to coordinate, and we don't have much of it. The council's next move is coming fast." "How fast?" 48 hours, maybe less. Samuel's voice was grim. The election is in 3 weeks. They need your assets liquidated and absorbed before the first debate. That means they'll move on Elena within the next day, use her as leverage to force you out of hiding. Elijah's jaw tightened.
Elena.
The woman who'd risked everything to warn him, who'd thrown herself at an armed man to save her daughter. She was in a safe house across the city, but safe houses were only as secure as the secrets they held. If the council knew where she was, can we move her, get her somewhere more secure? Moving her increases the risk of exposure, Samuel said. Her current location is known to only 3 people in our network, all of whom I trust with my life. But we need to accelerate our timeline. If we can get those records in the next 24 hours, we can break the coercion chain before the council has a chance to use Elena against you. Isabella stirred on her cushions, her eyes fluttering open. She sat up slowly, rubbing her face, and then looked at Elijah with that unsettling clarity that seemed to see straight through him. The tunnel opens at midnight, she said, her voice still thick with sleep. The water level drops when the tide goes out. There's a gate at the end, an old iron gate that's rusted almost through. We can break it with a crowbar and a strong push. Elijah blinked. How do you know the water level drops at midnight? How do you know about the gate? Isabella shrugged, a small, almost apologetic gesture. I dreamt it. I dreamt about the tunnel, about walking through it with you. I felt the cold water on my ankles and saw the rust on the gate. It was so clear, Mr. Montague, like I was really there. Samuel exchanged a look with Elijah, his expression unreadable. The child's gift is not just perception, he said quietly. It's something more. She sees possibilities, paths that haven't been walked yet. It's why I've been keeping her safe for as long as I have. She's a weapon, Elijah. A weapon that the council doesn't even know exists. A weapon, Elijah repeated, the words sitting strangely in his mouth. He looked at Isabella, at the small, fragile girl who'd already faced more danger than most adults could survive. She wasn't a weapon. She was a child who'd been forced to grow up too fast in a world that had no mercy for the innocent. I'm not a weapon, Isabella said softly, as if reading his thoughts. I'm just a girl who can see things. That's all I've ever been. Elijah crouched down to her level, his hands resting on her small shoulders. You're more than that, ISA. You're the reason I'm still alive. You're the reason we have a chance to fight back. And I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to you. Do you understand? No matter what we have to do, no matter what risks we take, I'm going to keep you safe. Isabella's eyes glistened, but she blinked back the tears before they could fall. I know, she whispered. I've seen it. You keep your promises, Mr. Montague. That's why I trust you. Elijah stood, his resolve hardening. Then let's get to work. Samuel, I need you to coordinate the distraction. Digital attacks, false intelligence, anything that will pull the council's attention away from the archive. Isabella and I will handle the tunnel. And once we have those records, we end this. Samuel nodded, already reaching for his phone. I have contacts who can make the necessary arrangements. But Elijah, he paused, his eyes serious. Once we start this, there's no going back. The council will know they're under attack. They'll retaliate with everything they have. Good, Elijah said, his voice cold. Let them come. I've been running from them long enough. Isabella rose from her cushions and padded over to the table, her small hand reaching for Elijah's. We need to go soon, she said. The tunnel is dark, and we'll need time to find the gate. I can guide us, Mr. Montague. I've already seen the way. Elijah looked down at the child, at the courage in her eyes, the wisdom in her face. He thought about everything he'd lost, everything he was risking, and everything he had left to fight for. Elena, Isabella, the loyalists who'd been waiting for a leader who wouldn't abandon them. The city itself, choking on the council's corruption. He squeezed her hand and nodded. Then we go together. You and me. And we bring this whole thing crashing down. Isabella smiled, and the light in her eyes was fierce enough to rival the sun. The Waterworks district was a graveyard of rust and silence. Abandoned pumping stations loomed against the twilight sky like skeletal sentinels, their broken windows gaping at the empty streets. Elijah kept Isabella close as they moved through the shadows, his senses on high alert, every flicker of movement triggering a spike of adrenaline. "The entrance is behind the old maintenance shed," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "There's a grate covered in debris. No one's touched it in years." Elijah followed her lead, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Samuel's diversion was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, a series of coordinated cyberattacks that would flood the council's communication channels with false intelligence, sending their security team scrambling in the wrong direction. The timing had to be perfect. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and they'd be trapped in the tunnel with no way out. They found the grate exactly where Isabella had said it would be, half buried under decades of accumulated filth. Elijah pulled at the rusted iron, his muscles straining, and slowly, inch by inch, it gave way. A dark opening yawned beneath, the smell of stagnant water rising from the depths. "Down there," Isabella said, peering into the darkness without fear. "The tunnel runs for about 200 yards, then branches off to the right. The gate is at the end of the right branch." Elijah lowered himself into the opening, his feet finding purchase on a rusted ladder that had been bolted to the wall decades ago. The metal groaned under his weight, but it held. He reached up to help Isabella down, catching her small body and setting her gently on the floor beside him. The tunnel was a cathedral of shadow and decay, its walls weeping moisture, its floor a treacherous carpet of sludge and debris. Elijah clicked on his flashlight, illuminating a narrow corridor that stretched into oblivion. Water pooled in patches, dark and still, reflecting the beam like scattered mirrors. Isabella didn't hesitate. She took his hand and began walking, her small feet navigating the treacherous ground with a confidence that left Elijah breathless. She'd never been here before, never seen this tunnel in waking life, but she moved as if she'd walked it 1,000 times. "There's a section where the roof collapsed," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "We'll have to crawl through. It's tight, but the path on the other side is clear." The tunnel narrowed as they walked, the walls pressing closer until Elijah had to turn sideways to continue. Water seeped through his shoes, cold and acidic, eating at the leather. He could hear dripping somewhere ahead, a steady rhythm that seemed to count down the seconds until the diversion would begin. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice low. "How do you know what's ahead of us when you've never been here before?" Isabella paused, looking back at him with those ancient eyes. "I don't know how," she said simply. "I just do. Like looking at a picture that hasn't been taken yet. It's always been like this, Mr. Montague, for as long as I can remember." Elijah thought about what Samuel had said, about her being a weapon that the council didn't understand. But this wasn't about weapons or strategy or the cold calculus of power. This was something else entirely, something that defied explanation, that made him believe in forces he'd always dismissed as fantasy. The tunnel branched off as she described, the right passage, leading into a wider chamber where the water pooled deeper. Elijah's flashlight swept across the walls, illuminating ancient graffiti, faded symbols that looked almost like they'd been painted by hands long since turned to dust. "The gate," Isabella said, pointing ahead. It was exactly as she described it, an iron gate, rusted and sagging, its bars eaten through by years of corrosion. A heavy lock hung from the center, its mechanism frozen solid. Elijah approached carefully, studying the gate structure, assessing how much force it would take to break through. "We need a crowbar," he said, scanning the chamber for anything that could serve as a tool. There was nothing but rubble and the detritus of decades. Isabella's hand touched his arm. "Look at the hinges," she said softly. "They're rusted all the way through. If we push together, I think it'll break." Elijah looked at the child, at her small shoulders and fragile frame, and felt a surge of protectiveness that almost overwhelmed him. "You stay back, Isa. If this thing falls, I don't want you anywhere near it." "I'm not staying back," she said, and her voice carried a stubbornness that reminded him of Elena. "We do this together, or we don't do it at all." He wanted to argue, to insist that she stay safe, but the truth was that he needed her. Her guidance, her impossible certainty, the strange gift that had brought them this far. He nodded, positioning himself against the gate, his shoulder braced against the rusted iron. "On 3, he said.
1, 2,
3. They pushed together, Elijah's strength and Isabella's determination combining in a single, desperate effort. The gate groaned, its hinges screaming in protest, and then, with a shriek of tortured metal, it gave way, crashing into the darkness beyond. Isabella stumbled, and Elijah caught her before she could fall, pulling her against his chest. She was trembling, her small body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, but when she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with that same fierce light. "We're through," she whispered. "We're through, Mr. Montague. We can get the records now." Elijah held her for a moment longer, feeling her heart beat against his own, feeling the weight of everything they'd risked and everything they still had to lose. Then he released her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Show me the way," he said. "Show me how we finish this." Isabella led him into the darkness beyond the gate, into a passage that sloped upward, toward the foundation of the archive building. The walls were newer here, concrete instead of stone, and Elijah could hear the distant hum of machinery overhead. They were close. So close he could almost taste it. They reached a maintenance hatch set into the ceiling, its bolts corroded but still intact. Elijah pulled out the knife he'd brought, working the blade into the gaps around the hatch, levering it open with slow, careful movements. The hatch groaned, then released, swinging down to reveal a dimly lit room above. "The basement," Isabella whispered. "The archive is on the level below this one. There's a staircase at the far end, past the storage rooms." Elijah boosted himself up, then reached down to lift Isabella into the room above. She landed silently, her feet barely making a sound on the concrete floor. The basement was filled with stacked crates and industrial shelving, the kind of storage space that looked abandoned but wasn't. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead, and Elijah's body went rigid.
Guards.
The diversion hadn't started yet. They were early, too early, and now they were trapped in the one place they couldn't afford to be discovered. Isabella's hand squeezed his, grounding him. "Wait," she whispered. "Watch." A guard walked past their hiding place, a rifle slung across his shoulder, his footsteps heavy on the concrete. He didn't look in their direction, didn't pause, just continued his patrol like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "He didn't see us," Isabella breathed. "We're still hidden. We just need to wait for the diversion." Elijah nodded, his hand still gripping hers. The minutes crawled by, each second an eternity, until finally, the distant sound of alarms began to echo through the building. Phones ringing, shouts, the pounding of running feet. The diversion. "Now," Elijah said, pulling Isabella forward. "We go now." The archive was a cathedral of secrets. Rows upon rows of filing cabinets stretched into the dimly lit space, their metal surfaces gleaming under the emergency lights that had flickered on when the alarms began. Elijah moved through the aisles with Isabella pressed close to his side, his eyes scanning for any sign of remaining guards. The diversion had pulled most of the security team to the upper floors, but there were always stragglers, always the ones who stayed behind to protect the most valuable assets. "Section G14, Isabella whispered, pointing toward the far end of the room. "The records about the coercion chains are there. All the blackmail files, the threats, the secrets they hold over people." Elijah navigated through the maze of cabinets, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. The air was cold and dry, the kind of climate-controlled environment designed to preserve paper for centuries. Everything about this place screamed permanence, control, the cold hand of power that never let go. He found the G14 section and began pulling drawers open, scanning the labeled folders with desperate efficiency. The names were there: Martin Cole, Victoria Ashford, dozens of others whose faces he'd seen around his estate, whose hands he'd shaken, whose loyalty he'd trusted. Each folder contained photos, documents, evidence of the coercions that had turned them into puppets. "This is it," he breathed, pulling a stack of folders into his arms. "This is everything we need." Isabella's hand tightened on his arm. "Mr. Montague, we have to go. They're coming back. I can feel it." Elijah didn't question her. He turned, moving toward the exit with the folders pressed against his chest, his heart hammering. The alarms had grown louder, more insistent, and he could hear voices echoing from the stairwell, guards returning to their posts, their patrols disrupted but not abandoned. They were halfway across the room when the first guard appeared at the far entrance, his rifle raised, his face twisted in shock. Elijah dove behind a row of cabinets as the first shots rang out, bullets tearing through the metal above their heads. "Stay down," he shouted, shoving Isabella behind the nearest cabinet. He pulled his own weapon, returning fire as the guard advanced. The exchange was brief, brutal. Elijah's shot found its mark, and the guard crumpled to the floor. But more were coming. He could hear them in the stairwell, multiple sets of boots pounding against the concrete. They were trapped, cornered in the archive with no way out except through the tunnel they'd come from. "The hatch," Isabella said, her voice trembling but steady. "We have to get back to the hatch." Elijah grabbed her hand, pulling her through the rows of cabinets as bullets tore through the space around them. They reached the maintenance hatch just as a second wave of guards burst through the doors, their weapons raised, their faces hard and merciless. "Hold them off," Elijah shouted, pushing Isabella through the hatch. "I'll be right behind you, Mr. Montague. Go." He turned, firing into the advancing guards, his shots precise and calculated. He'd been in worse situations, faced worse odds, but never with a child at his back, never with the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he could still save pressing down on his shoulders. 2 guards fell. A third ducked behind a cabinet, returning fire. Elijah felt a burning sensation across his ribs, but he ignored it, keeping his weapon trained on the exit, buying Isabella the precious seconds she needed to reach the tunnel. Then he was moving, diving through the hatch, pulling it shut behind him as bullets pinged off the metal. He hit the tunnel floor hard, the folders scattering, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything except the searing pain in his side. "Mr. Montague." Isabella was there, her small hands on his face, her voice frantic. "You're bleeding. You're bleeding."
I'm fine.
He forced himself up, forcing the pain down.
I'm fine, Isa.
"We need to move. We need to get these files to Samuel." Isabella's eyes were filled with tears, but she nodded, gathering the scattered folders. "We're almost there," she whispered. "We just have to get back through the tunnel. We can make it." They ran together through the darkness, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. The tunnel that had seemed so long on the way and was shorter now, every step bringing them closer to the surface, closer to freedom. But the guards were faster than he'd expected, their boots splashing through the water, their shouts growing louder. They reached the ladder just as the first guard emerged from the darkness behind them. Elijah pushed Isabella toward the rungs, firing blindly into the tunnel to buy her time. She climbed, her small body moving with desperate speed, and then she was through the grate, reaching down to help him up. "Come on, Mr. Montague. Come on." He grabbed her hand, pulling himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The grate crashed back into place just as the guard reached the bottom of the ladder, sealing him in the darkness below. Elijah collapsed onto the ground, gasping, the pain in his side blossoming into something that felt like fire. Isabella was beside him, her hands pressed against his wound, her voice a constant stream of comforting nonsense that he could barely hear. "It's okay," she kept saying. "It's okay, we made it, we're almost there, it's going to be okay." "Isabella." He caught her hand, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You did it. You got us out. You got the files. This is everything." "I know, Mr. Montague." Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were fierce. "I know. But we have to go. We have to get you help. We have to get Elena." The name hit him like a physical blow. Elena, still in the safe house, still waiting for news. Elena, whose life depended on the files they'd just risked everything to obtain. "Samuel," he rasped. "We have to get these to Samuel." Isabella nodded, helping him to his feet. The world swam around him, but he forced himself to focus, to put one foot in front of the other. The blue house was close, so close. They just had to make it a little further, but the streets were empty, the diversion doing its work. Elijah's vision was blurring at the edges, his legs growing heavy, but Isabella's hand was steady in his, her voice a constant reminder of why they were doing this.
Almost there, she said.
Almost there, Mr. Montague. You just have to keep going. They reached the blue house just as the first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky. Samuel was waiting at the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock at the sight of them. The files, Elijah managed, thrusting the folders into Samuel's hands. We got them. Everything. The coercion chains, the blackmail, all of it. Samuel caught him as his legs gave out, easing him to the ground. You're wounded. You need medical attention.
No.
Elijah grabbed his arm. No time. We need to use these files now. We need to start breaking the coercion chains. We need to get to Elena before he could finish. Isabella's voice cut through the haze of pain and exhaustion. They're already moving, she said softly. The council. They're sending people to the safe house. We don't have much time. Elijah closed his eyes, forcing himself to think. The files were the key. If they could get them to the right people, expose the council's network of coercion, they could turn the tide. But time was slipping away, the window of opportunity closing. Samuel, he said, his voice urgent. Start calling the names on the coercion list. Tell them we have the files, that we can free them. Tell them they have a choice. Stay loyal to the council and go down with them, or stand with us and fight. Samuel nodded, already reaching for his phone. I'll get the word out. But Elijah, you need to. I'll be fine. Elijah forced himself to sit up, grimacing against the pain. Isabella, come here. The child came to him, her eyes wide, her face streaked with tears. He pulled her into a rough embrace, holding her against his chest. You're brave, he said, his voice thick. Braver than anyone I've ever known. And you're going to be okay. I promise you. No matter what happens, you're going to be okay. Isabella nodded against him, her small arms wrapped around his neck. We're going to win, she whispered. I've seen it. We're going to win. Elijah looked at Samuel, at the files spread across the table, at the dawn breaking through the grime-caked windows. For the first time since the celebration, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually have a chance. The blue house transformed into a war room as the morning wore on. Samuel worked the phones with the precision of a general coordinating a battlefield, his voice steady and calm as he reached out to each name on the coercion list. Elijah sat propped against the wall, his wound hastily bandaged by Samuel's assistant, a woman named Maria who moved with the quiet competence of someone who'd seen her share of violence. She's a former combat medic, Samuel had explained when Maria appeared with her medical kit. One of the loyalists I mentioned. She's been waiting for this moment for years. Maria had cleaned and stitched Elijah's wound without comment, her hands efficient and sure. The bullet had grazed his ribs, deep enough to bleed, but not deep enough to kill. He'd been luckier than he deserved, and he knew it. Now he watched as Samuel made call after call, his voice modulating between persuasion and command depending on the recipient. Some of the coerced broke down in tears when they heard they could be freed. Others were suspicious, demanding proof that the files were real. Samuel directed them to specific details, dates, amounts, names, that only the true files could contain. Martin Cole is coming around, Samuel said, covering the phone with his hand. He's agreed to meet us. He wants to see the files himself before he commits to anything. Elijah nodded. Tell him to come here. And tell him to bring the financial records for the Ashford accounts. If he's serious, he'll prove it. Isabella sat in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes closed. She'd been quiet since they'd returned from the archive, her small face pale with exhaustion. Elijah watched her, a knot of worry tightening in his chest. She'd been through so much, seen so many things that no child should ever have to see. And yet she'd never faltered, never once asked to be spared the burden of her gift. Isa. He called her over, his voice gentle. Come here. She rose and padded to his side, settling onto the floor beside him. He put his arm around her, drawing her close, and felt some of the tension in her small body ease. You need to rest, he said. We have a long day ahead. I can't rest, she whispered. I keep seeing things. Fragments. Pieces of what's coming. Some of them are good, but some of them are dark. I can't tell the difference between what's real and what's just a possibility. Elijah didn't know how to answer that. He'd never had a gift like hers, never seen the future unfold in fragments behind his eyelids. But he understood fear, understood the weight of seeing things that no one else could see. "Tell me what you see," he said. "Maybe we can figure it out together." Isabella was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant. Then she began to speak, her voice soft and dreamy. "I see a building. A hotel, I think. It's beautiful. All glass and light. There's a party happening, like the one at your estate, but different. Less cruel. And there are people there, good people, people who've been waiting for this moment. They're celebrating something. What are they celebrating? Freedom." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "They're celebrating because they're free, Mr. Montague. Because you set them free." Elijah's throat tightened. He didn't know if her visions were real or just the fevered dreams of an exhausted child, but the image she painted was one he wanted to believe in. A world where the good people won, where the council's grip was finally broken, where Elena and Isabella and all the others could live without fear. "Samuel," he called out, "how many have agreed to switch sides?" 17 so far, Samuel replied, his phone pressed to his ear. "Another 12 are wavering. The rest are either dead or too terrified to act. But 17 is enough. 17 defectors will be a catastrophic blow to the council's operations." Elijah's mind was already working ahead. 17 defectors meant 17 people who could provide intelligence, who could identify the council's safe houses, who could help him launch the counterattack he'd been planning since the moment he'd fled his estate. "Tell them to stay where they are," he said. "Tell them to keep their heads down and wait for our signal. We're not going to strike until we have the full picture." Samuel nodded, relaying the instruction. The hours passed in a blur of calls and preparations, the Blue House filling with loyalists who'd been waiting for this moment, former employees, silenced journalists, victims of the council's cruelty who'd never stopped fighting for justice. By midday, Elijah had assembled a rough plan. The council's headquarters was in the financial district, but its members were scattered across the city, their movements tracked by the intelligence Samuel had gathered. The defectors were positioned to provide real-time information on their locations, their security details, their vulnerabilities. "Victoria Ashford is at the Ashford estate," Samuel said, pointing to a mark on the map. "She's been there since the celebration, under house arrest by her own family. The council doesn't trust her anymore. She failed to bring you down, and they suspect she's a liability." Elijah's jaw tightened.
Victoria.
The woman he'd almost married, the woman who'd betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. He should hate her. He did hate her in many ways. But Samuel had told him about the sister, the institutionalized child, the coercion that had turned Victoria into a pawn. "We need to reach her," he said, "before the council decides she's more valuable as a corpse than a puppet. If we can flip her, she can give us the Ashford network's full capabilities, their resources, their allies, their weak points." "That's a risky play," Maria said, speaking for the first time. "She might be desperate enough to betray the council, or she might double-cross us to save herself. We can't afford to trust her." Elijah knew she was right. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not after everything he'd lost. But he also knew that taking risks was the only way to win. Calculated risks, carefully weighed, with contingencies built into every move. "We'll offer her a deal," he said. "Protection for her sister, immunity for her participation in the conspiracy, and a future for both of them away from the council's influence. She'll take it. She has no other choice." Samuel nodded slowly. "I have a contact inside the Ashford estate, a mate who's been feeding us information for years. She can get a message to Victoria, discreetly, but we need to move fast. The council is planning a meeting tonight, a coordination session to finalize the absorption of your assets. If they succeed, we lose everything." Elijah's hand went to his bandaged ribs, feeling the ache beneath the dressing. He was running on adrenaline and spite, his body demanding rest that he couldn't afford to give. But there was no time for weakness, no room for hesitation. The battle was coming, and he had to be ready. "Isabella," he said, looking down at the child still pressed against his side. "Do you see anything else, anything about the council's meeting tonight?" Isabella's eyes grew distant again, her small face going slack. For a long, agonizing moment, she was silent. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a man at the meeting," she said. "A man who shouldn't be there. He's wearing a mask, but I can see his face underneath. It's someone you trusted, Mr. Montague. Someone you thought was dead." Elijah felt the blood drain from his face. "Who I say? Who is it?" She shook her head, her eyes glazing over. "I can't see clearly. Just a shadow. A man who should have died years ago, but didn't. He's been waiting for this moment, waiting to take everything from you. He's the one who orchestrated it all." Elijah's mind raced through the possibilities. Someone he'd trusted, someone he'd thought was dead. The list was short, the names etched into his memory like scars. But one name stood out above the rest, a name he'd buried so deep that he'd almost convinced himself it belonged to a different life. "Tommy," he breathed. "Tommy Sullivan." Samuel's head snapped up. "Sullivan, but he's dead. He was killed in the consolidation. He was supposed to be dead." Elijah's voice was hard, bitter. "But I never saw the body. I took the word of men I trusted, men who might have been in the council's pocket from the very beginning. Tommy was my right hand, my closest friend. He knew everything about me. And if he's still alive, if he's been working for the council all this time, then we're in more danger than we thought," Samuel finished. "Sullivan knows your tactics, your instincts, your weaknesses. If he's running the council's operation, he's been anticipating every move we could make." Isabella's hand found Elijah's, squeezing tight. "He's at the meeting tonight," she said. "I saw him. He's going to hurt a lot of people, Mr. Montague. We have to stop him." Elijah looked at the child, at the courage in her eyes despite everything she'd seen. He looked at Samuel and Maria and the loyalists who'd risked everything to stand with him. And he made his decision. "Then we stop him," he said. "Tonight, we end this." The Ashford estate rose against the twilight sky like a monument to old money and older secrets. Elijah studied it through the windshield of the battered sedan, his eyes tracing the perimeter walls, the guard stations, the shadowed windows that might hide anything. Beside him, Isabella sat in the back seat, her small body tense, her eyes fixed on the same patterns he was reading. "2 patrols on the east side," she murmured. "1 on the west. The main gate has 3 guards, but they're distracted. There's a shipment arriving in an hour. Supplies for the party Victoria's family is hosting tomorrow. They're expecting it, so they're not watching as closely as they should be." Elijah nodded. "How do you know about the shipment?" "I saw it in the kitchen," she said simply. "I don't remember ever being in that kitchen, but I saw it. They're nervous, Mr. Montague. They know the council is in trouble. They're just trying to pretend everything's normal." Maria was in the driver's seat, her eyes scanning the perimeter with the same professional assessment that Elijah was making. "We have 30 minutes before the patrol rotation," she said. "That's our window. After that, the guards change and the new ones will be alert. Then we go in now." Elijah reached for the door handle. "Isabella, you stay with Maria. If anything goes wrong, you get out of here. You don't wait for me. You don't come after me. You get to Samuel, and you keep fighting." "I'm not staying." Isabella's voice was quiet but firm. "I've seen how this goes, Mr. Montague. I need to be there. You need me to see the things you can't." He wanted to argue. Every protective instinct, he had screamed at him to keep her safe, to keep her away from the danger that was waiting inside the Ashford estate. But she was right. He knew she was right. Her gift had been the difference between survival and death more than once, and he couldn't afford to leave it behind. "Stay close to me," he said finally. "And if I tell you to run, you run."
"No arguments."
Isabella nodded, her small hand reaching for his. They slipped out of the sedan, moving through the shadows toward the perimeter wall. Maria remained behind, ready to provide cover or extraction if needed. The wall was higher than it looked from the street, its surface slick with dew. Elijah boosted Isabella up, watching as she scrambled over the top with surprising agility, then followed her over, landing silently on the manicured lawn beyond. The estate was quiet, its windows dark except for a few scattered lights that indicated occupied rooms. "Victoria's room is on the third floor," Isabella whispered, pointing to a window with a faint glow. "The west wing, the corner room. The maid who's helping us left the garden door unlocked." They moved through the shadows, past hedges and fountains, past statues that seemed to watch them with frozen eyes. The garden door was exactly where Isabella had said it would be, its lock disabled, its hinges oiled to silence. Elijah pushed it open and slipped inside, Isabella close behind. The interior of the Ashford estate was a museum of wealth and power, its walls lined with portraits of ancestors who'd built their fortunes on the backs of the city's poor. Elijah had been here before, as a guest, as a suitor, as a man who'd believed he was entering a new chapter of his life. Now he saw it for what it really was, a gilded cage, a monument to a family that had spent centuries destroying anyone who threatened their grip on power. The staircase to the third floor was dark, but Isabella navigated it with the same impossible confidence that she'd shown in the tunnel. Elijah followed, his hand resting on his weapon, his senses stretched to their limits. They found Victoria's room at the end of the corridor. Elijah knocked twice, a signal that Samuel's contact had provided, and the door opened a crack. Victoria's face appeared in the gap, pale and exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed with tears. "You came." Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "I keep my promises," Elijah said, pushing the door open, "even to people who don't deserve them." Victoria flinched, but she stepped back, letting them enter. The room was luxurious but prison-like, its windows barred, its door locked from the outside. She'd been confined here since the night of the celebration, a prisoner in her own family's home. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice trembling. "I betrayed you. I lied to you. I played a part in destroying everything you've built. There's no excuse for that. But there's a reason, and I need you to understand it before you decide what to do with me." Elena's sister, Elijah remembered. The institutionalized child, the leverage that had turned Victoria into the council's puppet. He didn't want to understand. He wanted to hate her, to blame her for everything that had gone wrong. But Isabella's hand was on his arm, grounding him, reminding him of the bigger picture. "Tell me about your sister," he said, and Victoria's face crumpled. "They have her in a facility in upstate New York," Victoria whispered. "They've been threatening to hurt her, if I didn't cooperate. She's all I have, Elijah. She's the only family who ever loved me, without wanting something in return. I couldn't let them hurt her." Elijah felt the anger drain out of him, replaced by a cold, tired understanding. He knew what it was like to be motivated by love, to sacrifice everything for the people who mattered most. He'd done it himself, just hours ago, when he'd risked his life for a child he'd barely known. "Where's Tommy Sullivan?" he asked, forcing himself back to the matter at hand. "Is he here? Is he coming to the meeting tonight?" Victoria's eyes widened. "You know about Tommy how? It doesn't matter how I know. Just tell me where he is." "He's at the council's headquarters," she said, her voice shaking. "He's been running the operation since the beginning, Elijah. He's the one who planned everything, the celebration, the betrayal, the absorption of your assets. He's been working for the council for years, waiting for this moment." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. Tommy Sullivan, his closest friend, his most trusted ally. The man who'd stood beside him through the darkest days of the consolidation, who'd promised to have his back until the end. And now he was the one pulling the strings, the one who'd been playing a longer game than anyone could have imagined. "The meeting starts at midnight," Victoria continued. "They're going to finalize the asset distribution. If they succeed, everything you've built will be in their hands by morning. There's no way to stop it unless we get to Tommy first," Elijah finished. "Unless we expose him and everything he's done." Victoria nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I can help you. I can tell you everything I know about the council's operations, their safe houses, their communication channels. If you'll protect my sister, I'll give you everything." Elijah looked at her for a long moment, weighing her words, weighing the risks. He'd been betrayed by the people closest to him, and every instinct told him to trust no one. But Isabella's hand was still on his arm, her eyes calm and certain. She's telling the truth, Isabella said softly. I can see it. She's scared, but she wants to help. She wants to make things right. Elijah exhaled, making his decision. Then we have a deal. You give me everything you know, and I make sure your sister is safe. But if you try to double-cross me, Victoria, I won't hesitate. I'll take you down with the rest of them. Victoria nodded, her face pale but determined. I understand. I won't betray you again, Elijah. I swear it. The information came in a flood of names, dates, and locations that Elijah committed to memory with ruthless efficiency. Victoria's knowledge of the council's inner workings was comprehensive, the result of years of being groomed to serve their purposes. She knew about the safe houses, the hidden accounts, the communication protocols that the council used to coordinate its operations. By the time she'd finished speaking, Elijah had a map of the council's entire network in his head. He knew where Tommy would be, when he would be there, and who would be with him. He knew the weak points in the council's security, the vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Thank you, Victoria. He rose, pulling Isabella with him. You've given us a fighting chance. Be careful, Elijah. Victoria's voice was soft, almost sad. Tommy isn't the man you remember. He's changed. The years of living in the shadows, of hiding from you, of working for the council, it's made him something else. Something cruel. He won't hesitate to hurt you. Elijah nodded, his face hardening. Neither will I. They slipped out of the estate the way they'd come, past the distracted guards and the silent hedges. Maria was waiting in the sedan, her eyes sharp, her hand on the ignition. What now? She asked as they climbed in. Now we end it. Elijah's voice was cold, determined. Get me to the council's headquarters. I have a meeting with an old friend. The council's headquarters rose from the financial district like a monument to everything Elijah had been fighting against. Glass and steel, cold and impenetrable, its windows reflected the city lights like 1,000 watching eyes. Elijah stood in the shadow of a neighboring building, Isabella pressed close to his side, his eyes tracing the patterns of guards and security systems that Victoria had described. The main entrance is the most heavily guarded, he murmured, more to himself than to her. But there's a service entrance on the east side, used for deliveries. Victoria said the cameras there have a blind spot at exactly this hour. Isabella nodded, her small hand gripping his. I see it. The guard is distracted, he's on his phone, not paying attention. We can slip past him if we're quiet. They moved through the darkness, their footsteps silent on the pavement. The service entrance was exactly where Victoria had said it would be, its door unlocked, its security feed looping a 30-second delay that Samuel's hackers had created. Elijah pulled it open and slipped inside, Isabella a shadow behind him. The interior of the building was a labyrinth of corridors and offices, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow on everything they touched. Elijah navigated by memory and instinct, following the path that Victoria had described. The meeting room was on the 15th floor, a penthouse suite that the council used for its most sensitive operations. They took the stairs instead of the elevator, their footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. Elijah's ribs ached with every step, the wound from the archive pulling and burning, but he ignored it. There was no room for weakness now, no space for hesitation. The 15th floor was quiet, its corridors empty. The meeting room was at the end of the hall, its doors closed, the murmur of voices filtering through. Elijah pressed himself against the wall, listening, counting the voices he could hear. There are 7 of them, Isabella whispered. Tommy is at the head of the table. The others are council members, the ones who've been running the operations. They're arguing about the asset distribution. Tommy wants to take a larger share than they're willing to give. Elijah's jaw tightened. Even now, even in the middle of their conspiracy, the council's members were fighting among themselves, their greed already beginning to tear them apart. It was the weakness he'd been counting on, the crack in their armor that he could exploit. Stay here, he said, turning to Isabella. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay here. Do you understand? Isabella's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she nodded. Be careful, Mr. Montague. He's waiting for you. He knows you're coming. Elijah's blood chilled. Of course Tommy knew. He'd always known everything, had always been one step ahead. But knowing and being able to stop it were two different things. He pushed open the doors and stepped into the room. The council members looked up, their faces frozen in shock. 7 of them, just as Isabella had said, seated around a long table that was covered in maps and documents. At the head of the table, Tommy Sullivan sat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Elijah. Tommy's voice was warm, familiar, the voice of an old friend who'd never betrayed anyone. I was wondering when you'd show up. I had a bet with Marcus that you'd be here by midnight. I won. You always did know how to read me, Tommy. Elijah's voice was ice. That's why you were so good at destroying me. Tommy laughed, a sound that echoed off the glass walls of the penthouse. Destroying you, I saved you, Elijah. I saved you from yourself. You were never meant to be a legitimate businessman, never meant to play by their rules. I was going to give you a place in the new order, a position that actually mattered. But you had to be stubborn. You had to keep fighting. Fighting for what's right isn't a weakness, Tommy. It's the only thing that's ever kept me alive. The council members were rising, their hands moving toward weapons. But Elijah was faster, his gun already in his hand, its barrel trained on Tommy's chest. Tell them to stand down, he said, his voice cold. Tell them to put their weapons on the table, or I put a bullet in your heart. Tommy's smile didn't waver. You won't shoot me, Elijah. You never could. You always saw the best in people, even when there was nothing good to see. It's your greatest weakness. Maybe. Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger. But I've learned a lot since the last time we saw each other. I've learned that some people can't be saved. Some people have to be put down. For the first time, something flickered in Tommy's eyes, something that might have been fear. You don't have to do this, Elijah. We can work together like we used to. You and me against the world. The world doesn't need us, Tommy. It needs people who care about something more than power. Elijah fired, the shot precise and clean. Tommy crumpled, his hand reaching for the gun he'd hidden beneath the table. The council members froze, their faces white with shock. Anyone else? Elijah's voice was steel. Anyone else want to make a move? The council members raised their hands, their weapons clattering to the table. Elijah's phone buzzed. Samuel, confirming that the defectors had been activated, that the council's network was in chaos. It's over, Elijah said, his voice echoing in the silence. Your network is broken. Your assets are frozen. Your leverage is gone. Every person you threatened, every secret you held, every crime you committed, it's all going to come out now. And you'll all pay for what you've done. Isabella appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale. She ran to Elijah, wrapping her arms around him, and he held her close, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through pressing down on him. Did we win? She whispered. Is it really over? Elijah looked around the room, at the fallen body of his oldest friend, at the defeated council members, at the evidence of a conspiracy that had been decades in the making. He thought about David Chun bleeding out in a service corridor, about Elena, waiting in a safe house across the city, about Victoria's sister, still institutionalized, still waiting to be freed. It's not over, he said, his voice thick. But we won today. We fought, and we won. And that means we get to keep fighting tomorrow. We get to build something better. Isabella looked up at him, her eyes shining. I saw this, she said softly. I saw you standing here, in this room, with hope in your eyes. I knew we were going to win. Elijah smiled, a real smile for the first time in what felt like years. Then let's get started. We have a city to rebuild, and a lot of wrongs to make right. The sun rose over the city like a promise, golden and warm, washing away the shadows of the night before. Elijah stood on the balcony of the Blue House, watching the light creep across the skyline, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into his bones. The battle was over. The war was won. But the work of rebuilding was only just beginning. Behind him, the Blue House had become a hub of activity. Samuel was coordinating with journalists and prosecutors, feeding them the evidence that would bring the council's members to justice. Victoria was on the phone with her sister's doctors, arranging for her transfer to a facility that wouldn't use her as a weapon. Maria was organizing the loyalists, preparing them for the transition that would reshape the city's power structure. And Elena was here. Finally, safely, here she emerged onto the balcony, her face tired but her eyes bright, her hand clasped with Isabella's. The child had refused to sleep, had insisted on staying awake until she could see her mother again. Now she pressed against Elena's side, her small body trembling with relief. "Thank you," Elena said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For saving her. For saving me. For giving us a future." Elijah turned to face her, his own throat tight. "I should be thanking you. Your daughter saved my life. She showed me there was something worth fighting for. I was lost before I met her." Isabella beamed, the tension of the past days finally releasing from her small shoulders. "We did it together, Mr. Montague. Just like I saw." Elijah crouched down to her level, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You're going to have a good life, ISA. I'll make sure of it. No more hiding, no more fear. You're free now, all of you." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tight. "Thank you, Mr. Montague. Thank you for believing me." He held her, feeling the warmth of her small body against his, feeling the weight of the future pressing down on him. There would be challenges ahead, reparations to make, systems to reform, a city to heal. But for the first time in his life, Elijah Montague felt ready to face them. As Isabella pulled back, wiping her eyes, Elijah saw something in her gaze that made his heart lift. It was the same look she'd worn when she'd first come to him, in the library of his estate, her voice soft and certain. A look that saw beyond the present, into a future that was still being written. "It's going to be beautiful," she said softly. "The city, it's going to be beautiful again. I've seen it." Elijah nodded, his hand resting on her head. "Then let's go make it happen. Together." The sun climbed higher, and the city below began to wake, its streets filling with people who had no idea that the foundations of their world had just been remade. And in the Blue House, at the center of the new beginning, Elijah Montague stood with the woman who'd risked everything and the child who'd shown him the way, ready to build a future worth believing in. It was the start of something new, and this time Elijah knew it was going to last.